Yeah, so hey, we literally just finished our first residency for almost a month in Switzerland, and I've just been madly sitting down like, what were the learnings from all of this? So bear with me, but what is Switzerland to start with? We are building a permanent Zuzelu node in Switzerland to accelerate frontier tech and do it in a safe way. We're inspired heavily by Vitalik's DIAC philosophy and by Swiss principles, and how all of this came about. So in 2023, I think 2 years ago now, Vitalik set up an event called Zuzelu in Montenegro with a few other people. It was a 2-month residency and essentially brought together thinkers, philosophers, builders from crypto, biotech, longevity, governance, and all sorts of essentially nerdy things that Vitalik was excited about. And it was, for me personally, a life-changing experience. I had said to my parents had always said to me, when you go to university, that's when you'll find your tribe of people that you will really nerd out with and you will grow together with. And I kind of had that at university, but it wasn't really like life-changing. And for me, that moment happened at Zuzelu in Montenegro. It was a moment of felt like the summer of love, but with a lot more purpose towards what can we actually do to change the world. And I think I had this moment of, this is the group of people that really has the most potential right at this moment to change the world in a positive way. I hope that that's true. And anyhow, so Vitalik had this event and then decided very shortly afterwards to decentralize the whole movement and have other people build Zuzelu pop-up villages. Initially, I personally and a few others were a little bit sad because the original had been so good, but eventually, reasonably quickly, we came to the idea that we would like to build our own thing. And I've been based in Switzerland for 10 years, and realized that aside from just being an amazing place for Web3, very Web3 positive, great place to build a company, it's also very aligned with DIAC philosophy, and if there's anywhere that you might build a Zuzelu hub and want to accelerate frontier tech, that Switzerland is actually probably that place. Why that? So there's a lot of reasons, but overall, Switzerland has a 700-year history of promoting social technology around decentralization and democratic principles. They're a direct democracy, and not only one of the only direct democracies, but an incredibly well-functioning direct democracy. They have multiple referendums a year. They decide on everything on a local level, from should we build a new pool in our community to what should the income tax rate be this year. You have low company and income tax rates, a high level of freedom, and a high level of individual autonomy, and it's overall a very, very well-functioning society. Importantly, though, it's not just well-functioning, it's also #1 in innovation per capita in the world and has been for around 20 years. So coming to the DIAC point, and if any of you saw Vitalik's talk before, if you read about the philosophy of DIAC, it's about accelerating technology because we believe technology is a good thing, but it's also about doing it in a safe way where you're defending against the possible negative outcomes. And Switzerland struck us and continues to strike us as one of the best examples in any nation state or any society in the world that has actually implemented what you could call a DIAC society. So if you look at, say, SF as EAC, it's incredibly good at the acceleration part, maybe not so good at the defense part. If SF is move fast and break things, then Switzerland is, in our eyes, move fast and try not to break things. And so we're essentially saying, okay, if we want to build DIAC, then Switzerland is the place to do it, and we want to build a permanent hub in Switzerland in order to do that and to learn from what they have done well, but also to build the next generation of society that is built on Web3 rails and fully Web3 enabled. So, who's seen this picture before? Okay, not so many. Excellent. Okay, so you can learn something new. This picture comes from Vitalik's essay on my techno-optimism from about 1.5 years ago. He talks essentially about the danger of having a one-sided view of like, technology is only bad and we should stop moving technology forward. You know, in particular, let's say in the face of AI and what's possible, if you only see the dangers, then okay, you stop technology and we stay a kind of a Luddite society. On the other hand, if you want to be accelerationist and you only see the optimistic outcomes, then potentially we all end up as NPCs that are controlled by AI or controlled by some techno elite that owns the AI. And his point was essentially that we need to be techno-optimistic and accelerate tech, but we need to do so with a view of the dangers in mind, and we need to find ways to integrate the caution around technology and around decentralization with the optimism and the acceleration. So some people have like a fear of DIAC of like, this is not about accelerating. It actually is about accelerating. It's just how are we accelerating in a way that we're also being careful. And it was interesting, and I won't stick too long on this, but there's a painting, a very famous painting in Switzerland called the Gotthard Post, which we realize kind of encapsulates exactly this principle in Swiss society. And the reason that this painting is so famous is that it's sort of theorized that the calves and the cows here represent the cautious and the agrarian traditional society, and that this cart of horses racing across the mountain, which is the Swiss Gotthard Post, represents progress and industrialization. And the big question in this painting is, does this little calf down here, does he get run over by progress, or does he manage to leap out of the way just in time? And the theory is that in Switzerland, he manages to leap out of the way just in time. These are a few examples of like what does DIAC look like in Switzerland very concretely. I won't go into all of these in detail because I have way too many slides. But as an example, when you move to Switzerland and you register your address, which I did 10 years ago, they hand you a packet of iodine tablets to take with you. And so like Switzerland is this peaceful country that's going for neutrality, and they don't expect to have nuclear war anytime soon, but they still do that one little cheap thing so that if something happened, you as a citizen would have a slightly better chance of not having the worst effects of radiation. Another example is that they have in Switzerland over 300,000 bunkers, and enough bunkers actually to house the entire population. So they do quite a bunch of things that help on the defensive side, and the idea really is if you do the defensive stuff well, you can actually enjoy more of the optimistic stuff. The 3 Ds in DIAC are sort of defensive, democratic, and decentralized. So on the democratic side, cooperatives are very strong. 25% of apartment buildings in Switzerland are run by cooperatives. Most importantly, the citizen initiatives and referendums. There's a really interesting talk that I watched recently where it talks about how in Switzerland, you don't think of the government as governing you, you think of the government as a service provider, and you, the individual, are the sovereign. And that's a very, very different way of thinking to a lot of democratic countries. So really, and this coming to the decentralized part, in Switzerland, things work from the individual up to the federal government and not the other way around. So you start with the individual as the sovereign, the family is the next unit, then your community and municipality, where you often decide on many things, and then you go up to the cantonal level, which is like a state level, and then the federal government. And ideally, in the way the Swiss think about things, the federal government does as little as possible. And that stuff's being challenged a little bit with the EU and trying to like come up with these national level agreements. But in general, this has worked very well for Switzerland for a very long time. And it's also, it drives the way that they think about everything in society. This really from the individual upwards rather than from the collective down. So when we were thinking about how do we build a permanent society that learns from this, we realized that really the magic sauce here is that if you want to build a state, you need something that is essentially a social technology for coordinating between the individual and the collective. And what Switzerland has done particularly well is enabled a society where the focus is on the individual, and the individual rights are really well defended, and there's a high degree of freedom. Also things about like to do with privacy. one of the reasons that the Swiss banking system became so famous is because they had this actual privacy around who is the owner of bank accounts. And so privacy in many different forms is a really core aspect of how Swiss people perceive their citizenship and their right to live. And then on the other hand, because they do a really good job of defending these things, and they do a really good job of being defensive, they get to coordinate extremely well because things are sorted out on the individual level. And what we essentially are trying to do with Switzerland is say, how can we learn from what they've built over 700 years of this very fine balance and integration of individual interests and thriving as a collective? Because yes, let's face it, if we do work together, as we can all see, society does tend to get better, and there tends to be more for all of us. But at the same time, if we go too far towards that side, we end up with a race to the bottom and a very unhappy outcome. So there's a lot to be learned from Switzerland, and that's what we're essentially trying to do. This just tries to put it into more concrete terms. So on the individual side, you have like the realist, the pessimism, the contracts, the hard governance, the defensive, the privacy. And on the optimistic side, the more solar punk side of things, you've got the collective, the optimistic. You work more with cultural norms, you work more with soft governance, and you work more in the explorative space. And these are things that are done, both of these things are done very well in Switzerland. And we believe that it's because ultimately the defensive individual side is given a certain amount of weight. So why a permanent sandbox? We did a look into a lot of the sociology and stuff, and essentially there's a lot of papers around real radical social innovation only happens in niches, or very often happens in niches. And so there's a number of examples of this in like the black churches in the south of the US that sparked the civil rights movement. You need this kind of protected space, often called a free social space, to allow for faster experimentation, to learn from things, and to have a thoughtful discourse, integrate, get something that's working, and then scale it to wider society. So that's what we want to do. And there's also a few, like the bunch of things that we've learned from Zuzulu. We want to have the network effects of SF, but outside of SF. We want to do more pop-ups. They're good. They're great at accelerating our defensive tech, but they're also expensive. So if we have a permanent space that we can do these things at a lower cost, that would be great. Also, we want to travel less. We lose a lot of productivity when we're constantly traveling to different places. And also, we're all grown-ups. A lot of us are growing up and want to have some level of consistency in our life. These are some of the technologies that we're looking at accelerating in Switzerland. But what are the goals of all of this? So we want to have a kind of a talent magnet to accelerate DIAC tech. We want to allow for cross-pollination, coordination, and acceleration. We want to allow for learning and knowledge transfer between builders. We want heavily to support open source and public goods, but we also need financial models to make that work. We want to have, and this one's really important, we want governance that's driven by those with a long-term stake in alignment. It's really easy to find investors for tech. What is a little bit harder is to find the right investors and to find models for investment that don't give all of the control of this permanent society that we might live in to people like Elon Musk. And we want to create some sort of sandbox that allows us to experiment and experiment fast and essentially create a permanent village that's a museum of the future. So you go to this village and you experience what living in a future society in 10 or 20 years might look like in other places. I think, what have we learned over the last month in Switzerland and in the Alps? We've had a lot of discussions about many, many things. We talked a lot about why this won't work, and there's plenty of these reasons. For one, many people have tried to create Silicon Valley or recreate it on their own before and have failed. Bootstrapping network effects, the kind of network effects that you want to have something that's like SF, can be very challenging. A lot of the success stories that we know and love of great kind of hubs or entrepreneurial inspiration points emerged organically and not because they were forced into existence. And then finally, and this is probably one of the bigger ones, high living costs in Switzerland and just the large amount of investment required to get there. So one of Vitalik's key challenges to us right now is let's work together to figure out the most investable model for these permanent hubs. So Switzerland is just one of many that will ideally emerge. There's one frontier tower in SF. There's also Healdsburg in California. There's Crecimiento in Argentina. So there's all of these kind of hubs emerging more permanently in the Zulu network, and we need a good way of funding these going forward. Why might this work? Well, coming back to that network, there's a lot of power in networks and in transnational support networks and seeding off each other, learning from each other, having a principle of fork and then remerge to main. There's a strong demand and need for a freedom-oriented jurisdiction for European and US founders. Switzerland could be seen as the US of Europe. So we're seeing a lot of people that are pretty frustrated with the direction of the US right now and are looking to Europe, but don't necessarily want to give up their SF-level incomes or their high quality of living, and Switzerland can be one answer to that. Third point, strong local support. So Switzerland has a really great ecosystem around crypto and Web3. There's a recent initiative being launched by the canton of Zug. They've given 40 million in funding to a joint research initiative between two universities to actually do more blockchain and Web3 research. And they're very excited to see more things like what we're doing being built, and so that will be a key a key aspect. There's also incredible institutions like ETH, which is sort of the MIT of Europe, EPFL, there's institutions like CERN, so the Large Hadron Collider. We have an incredible wealth of talent and research institutions in Switzerland that mean that we don't have to bootstrap these network effects entirely ourselves. And then, of course, there's the support from the Ethereum ecosystem that we feel will be critical. In terms of what the inspirations are for this, we've looked at Harvard and Stanford as one really key potential model to learn from. So you've got, why that? So Harvard and Stanford are private, profitable businesses, but they also provide a lot of public goods in the form of scholarships, fellowships, research funding, all the kinds of things that are needed to create a magnet for exactly the right kind of talent in one place and to subsidize the high cost of living that they have in the centers that they're based in. And they do this by having a large endowment fund and getting investment returns on that endowment fund that mean that the endowment fund doesn't collapse and become zero. And every year they spend a certain percentage of their endowment fund on these public goods. But the endowment fund is also always growing because they never spend more than the original capital. We're also looking heavily at Switzerland and Swiss cooperatives because they provide a really interesting model of investable, cooperative, direct democracy for real-world assets that are of high value, and they're working on a large scale. So they're an inspiration in the sense that decentralization can work, and DAOs maybe haven't completely failed, but there's a lot of tension between how do you start something as a startup versus how do you get to the point of decentralization and that point where you can have direct democracy. And then, of course, Ethereum and Silicon Valley are key inspirations in on the wider sense. So what does this actually look like? This is just one new build real estate project in Switzerland in the canton of Zug. It's a paper factory that's being converted into a real estate project, so it's a mix of commercial and residential, and they're creating an entire neighborhood of commercial, co-working, cafes, bakeries, there's a kindergarten being built, there's apartments for sale, there's apartments for rent, there's even a hotel being built. So they actually have this option where people that want to come in for a day, a week, or a month can stay there in this neighborhood. And we're not at all affiliated with this project, but I show it as an example of the kind of project that we could actually potentially either partner with or lease space from in the medium term, and start bootstrapping this village of 150, 200 people that live together and work together. And this is a great example because if you want to build something like this and do pop-up villages, you actually need a lot of temporary accommodation. So having this hotel on site, they also have an event space on site. It's a great example of what's possible in Switzerland already. It's also an example of an existing profitable project. So like when you're trying to build something that's investable, it's great to be able to look at something that's already profitable and go, okay, how do we like work from that backwards to what we need to build. So this is an interesting example of that. And what we're kind of thinking, and this is a total riff, so don't take this too seriously, but essentially we're thinking of having maybe two entities, one that is like a centralized foundation-like structure inspired by the Swiss National Bank. Why inspired by the Swiss National Bank? Because the Swiss National Bank's purpose is to essentially control the support the Swiss currency and be there for the people of Switzerland. But it's also a public company and you can buy shares in it. So it's a completely investable format that anyone, regardless of their citizenship, can invest in. And that we think that that's interesting because it's investable and it provides some sort of like public goods or funding or whatever it is to this Swiss people, but it's highly investable. And so we think we can take something like that, learn from it, take outside investor capital, create a vehicle that's highly investable via investing in DEAC startups, open source, and other nodes. So create essentially both open source and profitable businesses that create upside and provide returns both to investors but also to the society, and then have some sort of living cooperative where people can buy the tokens and with those tokens have a right to live in this hub either in the short term or in the long term. So what does it look like now when we go from here to there? We've had our 1-month pop-up residency. We probably now need to go and raise 10 to 15 million to fund the next steps. The next steps probably look like something like what I just showed you, figuring out a governance model to make that highly investable and highly livable for people, create something that at least 50 people want to live and work in full time, but probably that is more on the rental basis and not on a purchase basis. And then experiment and create this sandbox space of learning what do we actually need, what works, what doesn't, and then potentially sort of moving 3 to 5 years into the future, explore what does it look like when we really move into a longer term ownership model. You can purchase your real estate on chain, and we know that, for example, this is going to be our permanent community more long term, and really we're creating a village or a town. And ideally with that, an innovation fund and investment returns, where those investment returns create some sort of public goods or UBI for the citizens of this town. So what is it really? In the wildest dreams, it's a fully on-chain Web3 native village for 500 plus people where we're accelerating frontier tech and doing it in a way that people are not becoming NPCs for AI. I'll skip over this a little bit, but I think one thing that's important to highlight is our principle of subsidiarity and the principle that, yes, like we might run, say, the Switzerland municipality as a centralized startup initially, but that we're also wanting to create fully independent autonomous nodes that have some level of interoperability and interdependence with us. So, for example, we're talking to the World Ethical Data Foundation about building a World Ethical Futures Lab where they build highly ethical tech that supports things like privacy and human rights. Or we might work with Swiss economics to build a crypto economics lab, and figuring out ways where we can work together but retain the autonomy in the way that the Swiss people do, and maintaining that subsidiarity principle, and doing the same thing with other Zuzulu nodes where we want to support them and have them support us in different ways, but we want to maintain our autonomy and figure out what is the right thing for us to do while maintaining certain principles and interoperability with each other. And that, if we get that right, feels like the key to making Zuzulu permanent nodes a success and Switzerland of itself. I'll skip this a little bit. Like, this is just one idea of what 1 year at Switzerland might look like next year. we can have 50 people like living full-time and building this space as a permanent space, but then every 3 months essentially have a different long-term residency and incubation. So AIX crypto in the first part of the year, then ZK privacy focus in the early summer, go into BCI and robotics, and then towards the end of the year, bring it all together for a really large pop-up village where a bunch of ideas are funded and where out of those ideas, we have more permanent companies being built and additional nodes in our hub being built and more permanent residents. And the idea would be that at the end of, say, 2026, we have the MVP of a DX society that allows people to have an entirely private on-chain identity, check in, rent rooms, use accommodation without us ever knowing their identity, pay for their coffee with crypto without any hiccups, and be able to communicate fully privately. Yeah, I think we might have a minute or two for Q&A. And also, Veronica, if you want to throw in any learnings from this 4 weeks that we've done, feel free.
I think we have time for one question. Anybody has a question? Yes, at the back. I'll give you the microphone.
I didn't have a question, I just had a comment. I was part of Switzerland and it was an amazing experience. Me and Alta here are from Switzerland, and all of this, like looking back what we've learned, and yeah, it's been really amazing and excited to see what's coming up too. So, sorry about the no question, but just had a comment.
I should have said question or comment, but that was good. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming, and let's give a round of applause to the speaker, please.
Thank you.